For many decades, the home of Rob Reiner and Michelle was admired by the public as a symbol of a strong and close-knit Hollywood family. For children grew up together under one roof in Brentwood, surrounded by warm family gatherings and moments filled with love. Life appeared so peaceful that no one could have imagined it would ever be interrupted by such a devastating turn of events. Yet, on the night of December 14th, everything changed suddenly. Inside that very home, a heartbreaking incident occurred, leading to the passing of Rob and Michelle and leaving the family in deep shock. When authorities began their investigation and their son Nick was taken into custody as a suspect, many believed the painful story would soon reach its conclusion. However, that sense of quiet did not last long. Not long afterward, Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter whom Rob loved as deeply as his own, broke the silence with revelations that stirred public attention. She spoke of an unfinished will, of words her father never had the chance to express, of an apology that came too late, and of emotional struggles carefully hidden behind the family's calm exterior. "If my father had lived just one more day," Tracy said through tears, "perhaps things would not have gone this far." Before public opinion had time to settle, Romy, the biological daughter of Rob and Michelle, came forward with a very different perspective, further complicating the situation. According to Romy, the family's difficulties may have stemmed from long-standing issues related to unequal treatment among the children. Rob Reiner was known not only as a talented director, but also as a devoted father who always placed his family above all else. Despite a demanding career filled with major film projects, he consistently made time to care for, support, and guide his children. Tracy, the daughter he adopted from his first marriage, along with Jake, Nick, and Romy, the three children he shared with his second wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, all grew up under his attentive guidance. Rob's love for his children was not expressed through grand gestures, but through a quiet, steady presence that followed them from childhood into adulthood. "You are my whole world," Rob once told Tracy in a trembling yet sincere voice. "No matter what happens, I will always be by your side." For Tracy, his adopted daughter, Rob showed unwavering love and respect. He always regarded her as his own, listening to her, protecting her, and sharing simple but meaningful moments throughout everyday life. On quiet evenings, Rob would often sit beside Tracy, talking with her about work, life, and the road ahead. He always reminded her that no matter how challenging the future might be, she would never have to face it alone. "I know you're strong enough to take care of yourself," he once told her, "but I'll always be here whenever you need me." Those words gave Tracy a deep sense of security and made her feel surrounded by love. With Jake, his eldest son, Rob built a close bond through shared interests, especially their mutual love for baseball, a passion passed down from grandfather Carl Reiner. From Carl to Rob, and from Rob to Jake, that love was handed down gently and with great care. Father and son traveled together to many Major League Baseball stadiums across the United States, creating countless unforgettable memories along the way. Rob later shared that those trips were never just about watching baseball games. They were moments for him to connect more deeply with his son, to pass on love and family values through each shared experience. Over time, those journeys became treasured memories, where the bond between father and son was formed through simple yet deeply meaningful moments. Rob would often smile and say to Jake, "You know, sometimes I learn a lot from you." It was in moments like these that a lasting connection was built, one that time could hardly erase. And then there was Romy, the youngest daughter, who always received attentive care and heartfelt listening from both her father and mother. Rob devoted countless hours to listening to Romy's worries, dreams, and even her disappointments, making sure she always felt loved and protected. "I'll always be here, Romy," he once said with emotion. "No matter where you go or what you choose to do, I will never leave you." Those words, along with his warm embraces, became a powerful emotional anchor that stayed with her throughout her youth. However, with Nick, the relationship carried a very different tone. It was marked by tension, uncertainty, and long-standing emotional strain. Rob Reiner loved his son with a form of devotion that was both patient and deeply anxious, like a father constantly caught between fragile hope and persistent worry. Rob watched Nick grow up along a far more difficult path than his other children. Instead of steady progress, Nick's life was marked by repeated setbacks and moments of collapse, leaving his father's heart rarely at ease. From an early age, there was an unspoken distance between Rob and Nick, one that was hard to define. They struggled to connect, shared few common interests, and never quite found the natural harmony Rob had experienced with his other children. Rob believed deeply in stability, routine, and traditional values. Nick, however, showed signs of rebellion and emotional volatility from a young age. There were many late nights in the Brentwood house when Rob sat quietly, waiting for his son to come home, his eyes fixed on the slow movement of the clock. In those moments, he repeatedly questioned himself, wondering where he might have failed as a father. By the time Nick turned 15, substance use had begun to take hold of his life. What started with heroin and cocaine soon escalated into a long and severe struggle with addiction. Rob and Michelle were forced to watch helplessly as their son entered and exited rehabilitation centers more than a dozen times, experienced periods without a stable home while drifting between states, and endured countless moments when his life seemed dangerously uncertain. Each episode weighed heavily on Rob, filling him with fear and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. Desperate to pull his son back from the brink, Rob eventually chose what he believed was a form of tough love. Following professional advice, he compelled Nick to enter rehabilitation against his wishes and even withdrew financial support, hoping this would force his son to confront the reality of his choices. Years later, Rob openly admitted that this decision was the greatest regret of his life. "We trusted the opinions of experts more than we trusted our own son," he confessed. "They told us Nick was manipulating us, and we believed them." Beneath those words lay the deep remorse of a father who realized, too late, that his actions may have pushed his child further into isolation and despair. As a result, the relationship between father and son grew increasingly strained, burdened by conflict and emotional scars. There were long periods when Nick chose life on the streets over returning home. Rob and Michelle lived in constant worry, never certain whether their son was safe from one day to the next. Heated arguments, extended silences, and unspoken pain slowly widened the distance between them, making reconciliation seem increasingly out of reach. Then, in 2015, the release of Being Charlie offered what felt like a small ray of hope. Rob directed the film, while Nick co-wrote the screenplay, a story deeply influenced by Nick's own experiences. The creative process forced father and son to confront one another directly. There were intense disagreements and difficult conversations, but for the first time in years, they were truly listening to each other. Rob later reflected on that period, saying there were moments of intense confrontation, times when both father and son raised their voices at each other. Yet through those clashes, he began to understand more clearly what Nick had endured over the years. Nick also admitted that working alongside his father on the film had changed many things, helping to partially repair their broken relationship. Even so, the underlying tension between them never fully disappeared. Although Nick experienced stretches of sobriety and, for a time, lived in the guest house on his parents' property, ongoing mental health struggles and the constant risk of relapse remained quietly present. Michelle confided to close friends that they had tried every possible way to help their son, but over time, both she and Rob were becoming emotionally and physically drained. Just one day before everything unraveled, at Conan O'Brien's Christmas party on the evening of December 13, 2025, what should have been a joyful and festive gathering took an uncomfortable turn. Beneath the holiday lights and cheerful atmosphere, Rob arrived with Nick, yet the strain between them was difficult to hide. In front of numerous guests, Rob raised his voice, openly criticizing his son for behavior he found unacceptable. His words carried frustration and deep disappointment. The room quickly fell silent, as if everyone sensed that something deeply troubling was unfolding. Nick reacted sharply, visibly overwhelmed, his response fragmented and charged with years of unresolved pain and resentment. This was no longer a typical family disagreement, but the release of emotions long held back, a relationship suspended for years between love and suffering. In that moment, Rob delivered a final heavy statement: "I can't keep protecting you if you continue to live like this." He then turned away, leaving Nick standing alone in the middle of the gathering. Many later described that scene as a dark prelude. Perhaps it was the moment when all remaining efforts at reconciliation, forgiveness, and hope quietly collapsed. Christmas night was meant to bring closeness, yet for Rob and Nick, It ended in silence and broken eye contact. On December 14, 2025, the tragedy became reality. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found dead in their Brentwood home, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. Few could believe that a family long viewed as tightly bonded could reach such a devastating end. Early findings from the investigation quickly pointed to Nick Reiner as the primary suspect, amid reports that he was in a highly unstable state following years of addiction and unresolved emotional turmoil. Authorities stated that during a moment of lost control, Nick entered the kitchen and seized an everyday household knife. In the ensuing chaos, Michelle suffered fatal injuries. Hearing the disturbance, Rob rushed in, attempting to intervene and protect his wife, but he was also gravely injured. The entire incident unfolded rapidly, turning a once warm family home into the center of an unimaginable loss. Romy Reiner, the youngest daughter, returned home around 3:30 p.m., discovered her parents, and immediately contacted authorities. Nick left the scene shortly afterward but was arrested by the Los Angeles Police Department within hours near the University of Southern California. He is currently being held without bail on charges related to the deaths. While the investigation remains ongoing, forensic officials have stated that the evidence recovered is consistent with the weapon found at the residence. This was seen as the most devastating outcome imaginable, bringing an end to the long and painful journey of a family that had spent years fighting to move beyond the shadow of addiction. When Nick was taken into custody, the atmosphere of grief grew even heavier. The public mourned not only the loss of Rob and Michelle, but also recoiled at the possibility that the tragedy had grown from unresolved wounds within the family itself, wounds that never had the chance to heal. If the accusations are ultimately confirmed, it would mark the most heartbreaking conclusion to a father-son relationship that was once built on love, patience, and hope. As the glow of Christmas lights slowly faded, all that remained was a fractured family, a bond beyond repair, and countless unanswered questions that would linger indefinitely. Yet, amid all the loss, perhaps the most painful moment came when Tracy Reiner, the adopted daughter, finally spoke out. Her words brought the world to a standstill, revealing that the truth behind the tragedy was far more complex than anyone had imagined. While Hollywood was still enveloped in shock and mourning following the passing of Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner, Tracy became the first family member to break the silence. Her voice shook as she spoke, as though each sentence pulled another piece from her memories. Tracy said the pain had arrived too suddenly, too unexpectedly, leaving no one time to prepare. Just days before everything happened, she had still seen her father in person, heard his laughter, listened to him talk about ordinary, everyday things. There had been no sign that such a devastating ending was near. "I had just seen my dad last week," Tracy said through tears. That single sentence made the reality feel even more unbearable. In a brief conversation with NBC News, she struggled to contain the shock she was experiencing. "I come from the most wonderful family," she said, her voice breaking completely. "I don't even know what to say. I'm still in shock." These were not words spoken for attention, but the instinctive response of a daughter suddenly torn away from a world she believed was safe and enduring. Tracy shared that Rob and Michelle had been the kind of parents every child could only hope for. Rob, despite being deeply immersed in films that would later become classics, always placed his family above everything else. He taught his children the importance of honesty, compassion, and finding the strength to stand up again after every setback. Michelle, with the gentle nature of a photographer and producer, was the quiet presence in the family, the one who listened patiently and offered steady emotional support. Together, they created a home filled with warmth and laughter, even as they faced challenges that could not be avoided. What caused Tracy the greatest pain during the interview was speaking about Nick. She emphasized that her parents truly loved him, perhaps even with more fear and concern than they felt for anyone else. Rob and Michelle always viewed Nick as the most fragile of their children, the one who required the greatest care, patience, and understanding. "They always told me how much they loved Nick," Tracy recalled, remembering how deeply worried they were about him. Even during the most difficult periods, her parents spoke of Nick with expressions filled with both sorrow and hope. They understood that Nick had endured struggles his siblings could never fully comprehend, and that addiction had taken away much of his youth and inner peace. For that reason, in their will, they chose to leave Nick a larger portion of their estate, a quiet form of reassurance, a final message that seemed to say, "You are still our son, and you are still deeply loved, no matter what has happened." One evening, Tracy found herself alone in Rob's study, the room he treasured most. On the aging wooden desk, surrounded by unfinished scripts and pencils worn smooth by years of use, her eyes settled on a plain brown notebook with no title on its cover. It looked as though it had been resting there for a long time, quietly waiting to be opened. After a brief hesitation, her heart racing, Tracy turned the first page. In that instant, she realized she had entered the most private space of her father's inner world. What she found inside were not notes for work, but scattered, deeply personal reflections filled with anguish. Rob had written about Nick, his handwriting noticeably less steady. He confessed his regret over keeping too much distance during Nick's time in rehabilitation, believing that strictness would help his son grow stronger. "Maybe I was wrong," he had written. Maybe what he needed wasn't firmness, but someone willing to sit beside him, even in silence. Tracy read those words with trembling hands, her tears falling onto the pages. As she continued, Rob described the helplessness of watching his child drift further away, powerless to stop the descent. "There is no pain like seeing your own child suffer and being unable to carry that pain for them," he wrote. "If only I could take it from him, even for a single day." The words were unrefined and unguarded, like open wounds that had never fully healed. One passage, in particular, stopped Tracy from reading any further at first. Rob admitted that fear had followed him constantly, the fear that Nick might believe he had been abandoned. "If you think your father doesn't love you, that is my failure," he wrote. "I love you so much that I don't even know how to love you the right way." Tracy sank into the chair, clutching the notebook against her chest, finally understanding that her father's silence had never been indifference, but fear held deep inside his heart. Yet among all the pages heavy with regret, there remained a fragile sense of hope. Rob wrote of a simple dream, that one day Nick might live an ordinary life. Not one defined by success or achievement, but a life calm enough to breathe in peace. "If you can wake up each morning without hating yourself," he wrote, "that alone would be enough for me." Reading those lines, Tracy broke down completely. It was something her father had never managed to say aloud to Nick. She remembered the times Nick accused their parents of not understanding him, of turning away when he needed them most. She had argued back then, angered by those accusations. But now, holding the notebook, she saw a quieter, deeper tragedy. Two generations bound by profound love, yet unable to find a shared language to truly reach one another. On the final pages, Rob wrote a simple apology, one that would never be spoken aloud. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me." Tracy closed the notebook slowly, as if afraid that even the slightest movement might cause further harm to the words left behind. Standing alone in the quiet room, Tracy whispered softly, almost to herself, "Dad loved Nick so much. They just never knew how to say it to each other." The words faded into the silence, unanswered, yet it felt as though the old wooden walls were quietly bearing witness. According to Tracy, the greatest tragedy was not how much her parents had given, but that Nick had never truly understood that love. "They loved Nick so deeply," she said, her voice tightening until she had to stop and collect herself. "But maybe he never felt it in the way they hoped he would." It was not an accusation, nor a judgment formed too late, only a quiet grief, as if every opportunity to mend what was broken had slipped away unnoticed. For years, Tracy explained, Nick had often blamed their parents, accusing them of not understanding him, of not being present enough, of failing to love him in the way he needed. Sometimes those feelings erupted into anger. Other times they lingered silently, like an old, unhealed wound. Over time, those emotions built an unspoken distance that no one could quite name. Rob and Michelle loved their son in the only way they knew how, while Nick waited for something different. Greater closeness, reassurance, a hug, or a single sentence that neither side managed to give in time. Tracy remembered moments after arguments when her parents chose silence, believing that explanations had lost their power. Their love for Nick never faded, but it was constantly accompanied by confusion and the fear that saying too much might only push him further away. "They were in so much pain," Tracy said quietly, "but they never stopped hoping that one day, Nick would understand." She emphasized that, in her eyes, Rob and Michelle were not just parents, but human beings, always trying to do what they believed was right, even when it came at a great emotional cost. "My dad wasn't perfect," she said gently. "But he loved his children with everything he had. And that truth is what makes losing them so much harder to bear." As Tracy shared her thoughts, the Reiner family also released an official statement through the youngest daughter, Romy Reiner, the one who had directly faced the most devastating moment of her life. In a short message sent to Variety, the words read like a quiet sigh amid overwhelming loss. "We are deeply devastated by this sudden loss and ask for privacy during this incredibly difficult time." Only a few lines, yet they carried the immense grief of children who had lost both parents in a single, irreversible day. Romy Reiner, 28, a talented young woman pursuing careers in acting and screenwriting, was the one who went to her parents' home that afternoon. Living nearby, she often stopped by to talk, to share ordinary moments with Rob and Michelle, two people she proudly described as the greatest inspirations in her life. No one could have imagined that what seemed like a routine visit would turn into a nightmare. When Romy stepped into the familiar Brentwood house, she was confronted with a scene no child should ever have to face. Her parents lay motionless. Shock overtook her completely. She was unable to speak, her body trembling. Her mind felt emptied, as if pulled into a vast silence. According to those close to the family, Romy sat crying quietly in one corner of the house, tears falling without sound, as though making any noise might cause her already shattered heart to break even further. That moment left a deep psychological mark on her. Just hours earlier, her parents had still been there, Rob with his familiar warm smile, Michelle with her gentle, reassuring presence. Now there was only emptiness, and the memory of that moment followed her relentlessly. Mental health professionals note that shock of this magnitude can lead to lasting trauma, including recurring nightmares, overwhelming guilt, or a sense of emotional detachment from the world. No matter how strong she may appear, Romy is still a young woman facing the greatest loss of her life. In the days that followed, the family gathered together, Jake, Tracy, and those closest to them, to support Romy through the darkness. Yet everyone understands that wounds of this depth take an immeasurable amount of time to heal, if they ever fully do.